If you ever hear an alien scream in pure anger, the last thing you should do is walk toward it. That was the rule most frontier pilots followed. But Ethan Carter had never been very good at following rules, especially the ones that told him to ignore someone in trouble. The wind howled across the barren flats of Kepler Outpost 9, carrying with it the dry metallic taste of dust and old circuitry, the kind that stuck to the back of your throat and reminded you this world had never been meant for human lungs. Ethan's boots crunched across the rust-colored ground as he stepped out of his battered cargo rover, the vehicle's cooling fans whining softly after the 40-mile drive from the mining ridge. His suit HUD flickered in the corner of his vision, reading 84 degrees Fahrenheit despite the fading sun, with wind gusts pushing nearly 30 miles per hour across the open desert. Then he heard it again. A scream. Not the kind that came from fear, but something sharper, louder, burning with fury that seemed to cut straight through the wind. Ethan froze, tilting his head slightly as the sound echoed off the broken stone formations scattered across the plain. Well, he muttered under his breath, running a hand through his sun-bleached hair. That's definitely new. Most sounds out here were mechanical, generators, survey drones, the distant rumble of cargo haulers heading for orbit. But this was different. Alive. Angry. He followed the sound up a low ridge of cracked rock about 20 yards from where his rover sat idling. The horizon stretched for miles in every direction, an endless ocean of red dust under a sky slowly turning violet as the sun dipped lower. And there, in the shallow basin beyond the ridge, he saw her. The alien woman stood partially restrained by a circular field emitter anchored to the ground, a compact piece of off-world tech Ethan recognized immediately from old salvage reports. A hunter's restraint collar. Blue skin glimmered under the fading light, streaked with dust from the desert wind, and her posture radiated pure defiance despite the faint arcs of energy flickering around the device at her neck. She was tall, easily a head taller than Ethan even from where he stood, with silver-white hair whipping wildly in the wind like a banner. Golden eyes burned with anger as she struggled against the device, letting out another furious cry that rolled across the basin like distant thunder. Ethan slowly exhaled. Yeah, he said quietly to himself, staring at the scene. This is exactly the kind of situation people warn you about. His rational brain immediately listed the reasons to leave. Unknown alien species. Hunter equipment. Possible patrol ships nearby. Every frontier survival manual said the same thing. Don't interfere with other civilizations' conflicts. But Ethan had spent 12 years flying search and rescue back on Earth before he ever came out to the colonies. Some habits didn't disappear just because the planet changed. He stepped down from the ridge and began walking toward her. The wind picked up as he crossed the basin, pushing sand across his boots and rattling the loose metal plates on his rover behind him. The alien woman noticed him when he was about 15 yards away. Her head snapped toward him instantly. Those golden eyes locked onto Ethan with a level of intensity that made most people freeze where they stood. The collar at her neck crackled faintly as she shifted, the restraint field humming louder in response. Ethan stopped a few feet away, raising both hands slowly, palms open. Hey, he said in a calm, steady voice, the same tone he had used 100 times during rescues. Easy. The alien stared at him like he had just stepped out of a nightmare she wasn't prepared to face. Then her voice came out sharp and furious through the wind, her translator struggling to shape the words into human language. Human, stay back. Ethan blinked once. Then he did something that made absolutely no sense to her. He lowered himself to one knee in the dust and smiled gently. Relax, he said. I'm not here to hurt you. The alien woman did not lower her guard when Ethan knelt in the dust. If anything, the movement seemed to confuse her even more. The restraint collar around her neck emitted a faint electric hum as she shifted her weight, the small emitter unit buried in the sand projecting a pale ring of light that shimmered around her shoulders. Ethan had seen devices like that once before on a salvage run near Tau Ceti. Hunters used them to immobilize dangerous wildlife. Seeing one wrapped around a sentient being left a sour taste in his mouth. The wind gusted across the basin, tugging at his jacket and pushing fine grains of red sand against his boots. His rover's engine idled somewhere behind him about 40 yards away, its cooling system ticking softly as metal adjusted to the dropping temperature. The alien woman watched him with eyes that looked almost like molten gold in the fading sunlight. Every line of her posture was tense, ready, suspicious. Her translator struggled for a moment before her voice came through again, sharp and edged with disbelief. "Human, you should leave this place." Ethan tilted his head slightly, as if considering the suggestion. Then he shrugged. "I probably should." He glanced at the restraint collar, then back to her face. "But I have never been great at ignoring someone who is clearly having a bad day." The alien stared at him as if trying to decide whether he was brave or simply irrational. Her silver-white hair whipped across her shoulders as the wind shifted direction, carrying the dry scent of minerals from the nearby mining fields. "You do not understand," she said slowly. "Hunters placed this restraint. They will return." Ethan squinted toward the horizon out of habit, scanning the sky where distant clouds stretched thin across the violet evening. Frontier instincts never really went away. He had spent too many years flying rescue routes across deserts and oceans on Earth to ignore the possibility of trouble. For now the sky remained empty. No ships, no engine trails, just the endless quiet of an alien world. He looked back at her and nodded once. "That is good information to know." Her brow furrowed slightly, the motion subtle but noticeable. "You do not seem concerned." Ethan leaned back slightly on his heel, resting his forearms loosely on his raised knee. "Concerned is fair," he said calmly. "Panicking usually makes things worse." Another gust of wind rolled through the basin, making the field emitter flicker faintly as dust swirled across the ground. The alien studied him in silence for several seconds, clearly trying to understand the strange calm in his voice. Most beings she had encountered in the outer systems reacted to her species with fear or hostility. This human did neither. Finally she spoke again, her voice quieter but still firm. "Why did you approach when you heard my voice?" Ethan considered the question honestly. "Because you sounded angry," he replied. And angry people are usually either hurt or stuck in a situation they did not choose. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Your logic is flawed." Ethan smiled faintly. "That happens a lot." The restraint collar sparked softly again as she shifted her shoulders. The energy field shimmered brighter for a moment, reacting to the movement. Ethan leaned forward slightly, examining the small device half buried in the sand. Whoever designed that thing was efficient. Portable power cell, localized containment field, probably set to release when the control signal returns. He glanced back up at her. "That must be uncomfortable." The alien hesitated before answering. "It is inconvenient." Ethan chuckled quietly. Frontier translation for that usually means very uncomfortable. For the first time since he arrived, the alien woman seemed momentarily unsure how to respond. The wind carried another long silence across the basin as the sun dipped lower on the horizon. Then Ethan reached toward the small toolkit clipped to his belt and said gently, "Well, let us see if we can do something about that before your hunters decide to come back." The alien woman reacted instantly when Ethan reached for the toolkit at his belt. The restraint collar flared brighter, and she stepped back as far as the energy field would allow, golden eyes narrowing with fierce suspicion. "Human, do not touch that device." Her voice carried the sharp certainty of someone used to giving orders. Ethan stopped halfway through unclipping the small metal case and slowly raised both hands again, palms open to the desert wind. "Easy," he said calmly. "I was just looking." Looking leads to interference. Interference leads to consequences. Ethan considered that for a moment and then nodded thoughtfully. "That is fair. Consequences are usually how frontier life works." The wind shifted again, blowing a loose ribbon of red dust across the basin and rattling the casing of the restraint emitter half buried in the sand. The device hummed steadily, its faint ring of light casting a soft glow across the alien woman's blue skin. Ethan studied the mechanism carefully without moving any closer. Years of salvage work had trained his eyes to read unfamiliar technology the way mechanics read engine parts. The power source was small but efficient, probably capable of running for several days without recharge. The control node sat beneath the main emitter ring, protected by a narrow panel designed to discourage tampering. Hunters like their equipment durable. The alien watched him with growing confusion. Most humans she had encountered were either aggressive or fearful. This one appeared neither. Instead, he sat calmly in the dust, as if examining a stubborn farm tractor that refused to start. Finally, she spoke again. Her voice edged with impatience. Why are you studying it? Ethan tilted his head slightly, squinting at the emitter as another gust of wind kicked sand against the casing. Because whoever left you here clearly expected you to stay put, he replied. And I have never liked equipment that assumes it is in charge. Her brow tightened slightly. That statement makes little sense. Ethan smiled faintly. It does if you have ever spent 3 hours arguing with a broken cargo drone. The alien blinked slowly, clearly uncertain how to process that comparison. Ethan finally unclipped the small toolkit from his belt and set it on the ground beside him without opening it. The metal case thudded softly against the packed sand. Do not worry, he said, noticing the tension in her shoulders. I am not about to dismantle alien technology one barely understand. That would be reckless. Her eyes narrowed. You approached a restrained alien on an unprotected desert world. Ethan nodded. Fair point. The sun dipped lower behind the rocky ridges to the west, stretching long shadows across the basin. The temperature began to fall quickly, dropping several degrees in just a few minutes as the desert shifted from day to evening. Ethan's suit display flickered again inside his visor, adjusting the environmental readout. He glanced briefly at the sky out of habit, scanning the empty horizon. Still no ships. Still only wind. When he looked back, the alien woman was watching him with an expression that had softened slightly from outright hostility to cautious curiosity. You remain here despite the warning I gave you, she said slowly. Ethan brushed dust from his knee and leaned back slightly. That is true. Why? Ethan looked up at her, as if the answer were obvious. Because you are still stuck in that thing. The alien hesitated. And you believe you can help. Ethan shrugged. Maybe. Maybe not. But sitting here talking about it seems better than pretending I did not hear you. Another long silence stretched between them as the wind rolled through the basin again. The energy collar hummed. Quietly in the fading light. Finally the alien spoke again, her voice lower now, less sharp than before. Human, what is your name? Ethan rested his forearms on his knee and answered simply. Ethan Carter. He paused, then added gently, and you are? The alien woman studied him for another moment before replying. Lyra. Ethan smiled slightly at the name as the last edge of sunlight slipped behind the horizon. Well, Lyra, he said calmly, let us figure out what those hunters thought they were leaving behind. The desert grew quieter as the last band of sunlight disappeared beyond the jagged hills, leaving the sky above Kepler Outpost 9 washed in deep violet and scattered silver stars. Ethan Carter remained seated in the dust, studying the restraint emitter while the wind carried long sighing currents across the open basin. The temperature on his suit display slipped from 80 degrees down to 73 within minutes, the kind of sudden cooling that always reminded him this world had no oceans to soften its moods. Lyra watched him carefully from within the faint circle of light surrounding her, the glow of the restraint collar tracing a pale ring across the smooth blue skin of her neck. Her golden eyes moved between Ethan, the small metal toolkit resting beside him, and the empty horizon beyond his rover. For several long seconds, she said nothing. Finally, she spoke again, her voice steady but quieter than before. You remain unusually calm for someone who may soon face hunters. Ethan glanced up toward the stars, as if checking the weather before answering. I have faced worse situations with less warning, he said. Frontier life teaches you that worrying early does not solve much. Lyra tilted her head slightly, studying him with the careful attention of someone reassessing a strange puzzle. Your species is not known for patience. Ethan chuckled softly at that. Fair observation. We tend to rush into things. But we also learn from mistakes. He leaned forward a little, resting his hands loosely on his knees while his eyes returned to the restraint device half buried in the sand. The emitter hummed steadily, its faint light pulsing every few seconds like a quiet heartbeat. Whoever designed it had done careful work. Compact, efficient, built for portability and endurance. He reached toward the casing slowly this time, moving only his fingertips across the outer shell, without touching the active ring. Lyra stiffened again, but she did not shout for him to stop. Ethan noticed the change immediately. That small shift in trust meant more than most people realized. Relax, he said gently. I am not trying to remove it yet. I am just learning how it thinks. Lyra frowned slightly. Machines do not think. Ethan smiled. You would be surprised how many act like they do. Another wind gust swept across the basin, carrying a thin veil of dust that rattled against the emitter housing. The device flickered faintly as grains of sand slid across its surface. Ethan brushed the dust aside with the back of his glove, revealing a narrow panel along the lower edge. "There we go," he murmured quietly. Lyra leaned forward slightly despite herself. "What did you find?" Ethan tapped the metal surface lightly with one finger. "Access seam. Probably for maintenance or power cycling. Hunters expect their gear to survive rough environments." Lyra studied the panel with growing curiosity. "And you believe that opening it will free the collar?" Ethan shook his head. "Not exactly, but it might tell me how the release signal works." He leaned back again, keeping his movements slow and deliberate so the restraint field would not react. The collar hummed softly, but did not flare. Lyra watched him in silence for several moments before speaking again. "Why would you risk interfering with hunters for a stranger?" Ethan thought about that question longer than the others. The wind moved gently across the basin now, quieter than before as night settled in. Finally, he answered in the same calm voice he had used since arriving. "Because someone left you here expecting the universe not to care." He lifted his eyes to meet hers. "And sometimes the universe needs a little help proving them wrong." Lyra stared at him, the anger in her golden eyes slowly giving way to something more uncertain, something thoughtful. For the first time since Ethan had walked down the ridge, the tension in her shoulders eased just slightly. Ethan noticed it immediately. "Good," he said quietly, turning back to the emitter. "That is a start. Now let us see if your hunters built something smarter than a tired salvage pilot from Earth." The night air continued to cool across the desert basin as Ethan Carter leaned closer to the restraint emitter, the stars. Above Kepler Outpost 9 growing brighter with every passing minute. The device hummed steadily beneath his hand, a quiet mechanical pulse that reminded him of the countless machines he had repaired during his years flying search and rescue missions across Earth's oceans and mountain ranges. Lyra remained within the ring of pale light, watching every movement he made with intense concentration. The anger that had filled her voice earlier had faded into something more cautious, though her posture remained upright and guarded. Ethan brushed another thin layer of dust away from the narrow maintenance seam he had discovered earlier, revealing a thin metallic latch barely wider than a pencil. "Whoever built this did not want casual tampering," he murmured to himself. Lyra's eyes followed his hand carefully. "You speak to machines often," she said. Ethan gave a small shrug. "Only when they refuse to cooperate. Machines usually listen eventually." The restraint collar around her neck pulsed faintly as the emitter reacted to subtle fluctuations in the desert wind. Ethan slowly opened the small metal toolkit resting beside his knee and selected a narrow instrument no larger than a screwdriver. He held it up briefly so Lyra could see it clearly before moving closer to the emitter housing. "This tool is not a weapon," he said calmly. "It is meant for electronics." Lyra studied the instrument, then nodded once with cautious understanding. Ethan leaned forward and carefully inserted the tip into the seam along the maintenance panel. The metal clicked softly as he applied gentle pressure. The emitter responded with a slightly louder hum, its internal systems clearly aware that something unusual was happening. Ethan paused immediately and lifted his hand away. "See that?" he said quietly. It noticed. Lyra watched the device carefully. "Does that mean it will activate stronger restraints?" "Possibly," Ethan replied. "Or it might be sending a status signal to the hunters who placed it here." Lyra's golden eyes flickered toward the sky for a moment before returning to him. "That is what I feared." Ethan studied the emitter again, thinking carefully. Then he reached out and tapped the metal casing lightly twice with his knuckle. The device hummed, but did not react further. "Interesting," he said softly. Lyra tilted her head slightly. "You appear pleased." Ethan nodded slowly. "Because whoever designed this expected someone to panic and force it open. Panic usually triggers defensive systems. But if you approach slowly, the machine assumes maintenance instead of interference." Lyra considered that explanation carefully. "Your species uses deception when dealing with machines." Ethan smiled faintly. "We call it patience." He adjusted the angle of the tool and gently lifted the small latch hidden beneath the seam. The maintenance panel slid open about half an inch with a quiet metallic sound. Inside, a narrow strip of glowing circuitry revealed itself beneath the dust. Lyra leaned forward despite herself, curiosity replacing the last traces of hostility. The collar around her neck dimmed slightly as the emitter adjusted its internal power flow. Ethan studied the circuitry carefully for several seconds before speaking again. "All right," he said quietly. "Now we know how it breathes." Lyra watched him closely. "And does that knowledge free me?" Ethan slowly set the tool back inside the open toolkit and brushed dust from his glove. "Not yet," he said calmly. "But it means the hunters made one small mistake." Lyra's eyes narrowed slightly. "What mistake?" Ethan looked up at her with the faint, confident smile of someone who had spent years solving problems in impossible places. "They assumed nobody would bother trying." The small maintenance panel remained open as the alien restraint emitter hummed quietly in the cooling desert air, its internal circuitry glowing with a soft pale light beneath the stars of Kepler Outpost 9. Ethan Carter leaned closer, studying the delicate pattern of alien engineering while the wind carried long, slow currents of dust across the basin. The desert had grown noticeably colder now, his suit display reading 68 degrees Fahrenheit and falling steadily as night settled deeper across the planet. Lyra stood within the dim containment field watching him with unwavering attention, her golden eyes reflecting the faint blue light of the exposed circuitry. The anger that had once burned in her voice had faded into focused curiosity, though the tension in her posture had not completely disappeared. Ethan rested one elbow lightly on his knee while examining the glowing lines inside the emitter housing. Whoever designed this device clearly believed in efficiency. The circuitry ran in a tight spiral pattern around the control node, with 3 small energy regulators feeding power toward the collar around Lyra's neck. It was elegant engineering, compact and resilient, exactly the kind of design hunters preferred when operating far from support stations. Lyra broke the silence. After several seconds, "You said they made a mistake." Ethan nodded slowly while tracing the circuit path with his eyes. "Yes, a small one. But sometimes small mistakes matter more than large ones." Lyra folded her arms across her chest as much as the restraint field allowed. "Explain." Ethan shifted slightly in the sand and tapped one of the glowing regulators gently with the back of his gloved finger without actually touching the circuitry. "Most machines like this follow a simple rule," he said. "They are built to resist force, but not curiosity." Lyra frowned faintly. "That explanation lacks clarity." Ethan smiled softly. "Hunters expect someone to try breaking the emitter from the outside. They expect panic, pressure, sudden interference. That triggers the defensive routines inside the system." Lyra glanced down toward the device and then back at him. "And you avoided that." "Exactly." Ethan pointed toward the open maintenance seam. "That panel is designed for technicians. Someone who understands the equipment would open it carefully instead of forcing it. So the system assumes maintenance mode instead of threat mode." Lyra's eyes narrowed slightly as the logic settled in her mind. "Which means the restraint collar is temporarily lowering its defensive protocols." Ethan nodded once. "That is exactly what it means." The wind swept across the basin again, rattling loose grains of sand against the emitter casing. The humming tone of the device softened slightly as its internal regulators adjusted to the exposed circuitry. Lyra looked down at the collar around her neck and then back at Ethan with renewed focus. "Can you disable it?" Ethan studied the regulator nodes again before answering. "Possibly, but doing it too quickly could activate a safety response." Lyra tilted her head. "Safety response?" Ethan gave a small shrug. "Hunters usually want their prisoners alive, but they also want them contained. If the system believes someone is trying to sabotage it, the collar might lock completely until the hunters return." Lyra's expression tightened slightly. "That would be inconvenient." Ethan chuckled quietly. "Yes, that would definitely make our evening more complicated." He carefully reached into his toolkit again and removed a thin, insulated probe no longer than 6 inches. The tool glinted briefly in the starlight before he held it near the exposed circuitry without touching it. Lyra watched the movement closely. "Your confidence suggests experience with unfamiliar technology." Ethan exhaled slowly. "Salvage work teaches you many things, especially patience." The wind grew quieter as the basin settled into full night. Above them the stars stretched across the sky like scattered frost. Ethan slowly moved the probe closer to the first regulator node, studying the way the energy pattern flowed between the glowing lines. Then he spoke quietly, almost to himself. "There it is." Lyra leaned forward slightly. "What did you see?" Ethan lifted the probe and pointed toward a tiny junction where 3 circuits intersected. The release command pathway. Lyra's golden eyes widened slightly. And you can trigger it. Ethan looked up at her with a calm expression that carried equal parts caution and determination. Maybe. But if I do this wrong, the hunters will know immediately that someone helped you. He paused for a moment before adding softly. Which means we both need to decide something before I touch that circuit. The desert night had fully settled over Kepler Outpost 9, and the temperature had dropped to 62 degrees Fahrenheit, according to Ethan Carter's suit display. The wind that had howled across the basin earlier now moved in slower, colder currents, whispering through the scattered rock formations like distant waves against a shoreline. Ethan remained kneeling beside the restraint emitter, the thin insulated probe resting carefully between his fingers while the open maintenance panel glowed faintly beneath the starlight. Lyra stood within the pale containment ring only a few feet away, watching him with a steady intensity that had replaced the anger she once carried. The golden glow of her eyes reflected the delicate circuitry inside the emitter as she studied every motion of his hands. Ethan had not moved the probe yet. Instead, he sat quietly for several seconds, examining the tiny junction where 3 narrow streams of energy converged. The pattern pulsed in a steady rhythm, almost like breathing. Finally, Lyra broke the silence. You said we must decide something before you touch that circuit. Ethan nodded slowly without lifting his eyes from the glowing lines. Yes, because the moment this restraint releases, whoever placed it here will know something changed. Lyra tilted her head slightly. How can they know? Ethan gently rotated the probe in his fingers as he spoke. Machines like this report their status back to whoever controls them. When the collar unlocks, the system will send a signal confirming the release event. Lyra's gaze moved toward the dark horizon where the empty sky stretched endlessly above the desert. The hunters will return. Ethan shrugged lightly. Maybe. Or maybe they already plan to return and simply expect you to still be here when they do. Lyra looked back down at him. And if they discover you helped me? Ethan finally glanced up, meeting her eyes with a calm expression that seemed almost amused by the question. Then I suppose they will not be very happy with me. The wind lifted a strand of Lyra's silver-white hair, carrying it briefly across her shoulder before the night air settled again. She studied him carefully, as though trying to measure the strange calm inside him. Most beings would avoid becoming involved in conflicts beyond their species. Ethan smiled faintly. Most beings are probably smarter than I am. Lyra's expression shifted slightly, something close to curiosity, replacing the guarded suspicion she had shown earlier. Why would you risk this for someone you met only minutes ago? Ethan leaned back slightly and rested his free hand on his knee while the probe remained poised above the circuitry. He thought about the question longer this time. The stars overhead shone brighter now, unobstructed by clouds or city lights. A reminder that the frontier rarely cared about the choices of those living beneath it. Finally, he answered quietly. Because I spent 12 years pulling strangers out of bad situations. Out on the frontier, you learn something important. Lyra waited patiently. Ethan lifted his eyes toward her again. Nobody survives out here alone for very long. The wind moved across the basin again, colder now, rustling the edges of Ethan's jacket and sending a soft ripple through the dust surrounding the emitter. Lyra looked down at the collar around her neck, then back at the small glowing circuit Ethan had identified earlier. If you release this restraint, she said slowly, the hunters may track the signal directly here. Ethan nodded once. That is possible. Lyra held his gaze steadily. Then we should not remain here after you disable it. Ethan's faint smile returned, a little wider this time. Now you are thinking like a frontier pilot. He shifted slightly in the sand and raised the probe again, positioning the insulated tip above the narrow junction of energy lines. The device hummed quietly beneath his hand, unaware that its carefully designed control pathway had just been discovered. Ethan exhaled slowly as he focused on the glowing intersection. All right, he murmured softly. Let us see if your hunters built something clever enough to notice one small change. The insulated probe hovered a fraction of an inch above the glowing junction where the 3 energy pathways met, and Ethan Carter held his breath for a moment as if listening to the quiet mechanical rhythm of the restraint emitter. The night air across the basin had grown colder still, the temperature slipping to 60 degrees Fahrenheit as the wind moved slowly through the scattered rocks and empty sand. Above them, the stars stretched across the sky in sharp, bright clusters, the kind of clear frontier sky that made a person feel both very small and strangely calm at the same time. Lyra stood only a few feet away within the faint ring of light projected by the emitter, her golden eyes fixed on the tiny motion of Ethan's hand. She had not moved since he lifted the probe, as if even the smallest motion might disturb the delicate moment unfolding between them and the alien machine. Ethan finally lowered the tip of the probe and touched the narrow circuit junction with the gentlest pressure he could manage. The emitter reacted instantly. The humming tone deepened for half a second, shifting into a slightly higher pitch as the internal regulators sensed a change in the energy flow. Ethan did not pull the probe away. Instead, he held it steady and watched the circuit pattern carefully. The glowing lines flickered once, then began to reroute energy along a secondary pathway inside the device. "There it is," he murmured softly. Lyra leaned forward slightly despite herself. "What is happening?" Ethan kept his eyes on the circuitry as he answered. "The system thinks it is receiving a maintenance command. That junction I touched carries the release confirmation signal." Lyra's voice lowered with cautious hope. "Which means the collar will unlock eventually." Ethan shifted the probe a few millimeters to the left, adjusting the contact point with careful precision. The emitter's humming tone changed again, softer this time, almost uncertain. A faint ripple of pale light moved across the restraint field surrounding Lyra. She felt it immediately. The collar around her neck dimmed slightly, its steady glow weakening for the first time since Ethan had arrived. Lyra's eyes widened in quiet disbelief. "The restraint field is weakening." Ethan nodded slowly while keeping the probe steady. "Good sign. That means the regulators are beginning the release sequence." The wind moved across the basin again, stirring the dust around Ethan's boots and brushing against the metal casing of the emitter. For a moment, nothing else happened. The device continued its quiet humming as the energy lines inside the maintenance panel shifted gradually into a new pattern. Lyra looked down at the collar again, then back toward the dark horizon. "If the system sends a signal to the hunters," she said carefully, "they may already know." Ethan glanced up at the stars briefly before returning his attention to the circuitry. "That is possible, but machines often delay their reports until the command sequence completes." Lyra studied him closely. "You sound confident." Ethan gave a small shrug. "I sound hopeful. There is a difference." Another flicker of light moved through the emitter housing. The humming tone dropped lower, as if the device itself were slowly exhaling. Then the collar around Lyra's neck emitted a soft chime barely louder than the wind. Both of them heard it. The restraint field surrounding her flickered once. Ethan slowly lifted the probe away from the circuit. "That should do it," he said quietly. For 2 long seconds nothing happened. Then the faint ring of light surrounding Lyra collapsed silently into the emitter base, and the collar around her neck dimmed to a soft inactive glow before releasing with a gentle metallic click. Lyra stood perfectly still, as if uncertain whether she had truly been freed. Ethan closed the small maintenance panel and brushed sand from the device casing. "Well," he said calmly as he rose to his feet, "that part worked exactly the way I hoped." Lyra lifted one hand slowly to her neck, touching the inactive collar in disbelief while the cold desert wind moved freely around her for the first time since Ethan had arrived. For several seconds Lyra did not move. Her hand remained against the collar resting loosely around her neck, her fingers slowly tracing the smooth alien metal as if confirming it was truly inactive. The desert wind moved freely across her shoulders now, no longer blocked by the invisible containment field that had surrounded her moments before. Ethan Carter stepped back from the emitter and brushed the dust from his gloves while the quiet hum of the machine faded into a soft standby tone. The basin felt strangely larger now that the pale restraint light had disappeared. Lyra lowered her hand slowly and lifted her eyes toward Ethan. The disbelief in her expression had not yet faded. "You actually released it," she said quietly. Ethan gave a small shrug and closed the lid of his toolkit. "That was the goal." Lyra turned her head slightly and looked around the open desert, as if experiencing the night air for the first time in hours. The stars stretched endlessly across the sky above them, and the wind carried the cool mineral scent of distant rock fields. For a moment, she simply stood there breathing. Ethan noticed the change immediately. The tight tension that had filled her posture when he first arrived was gone. She still held herself with the natural alertness of someone used to danger, but the anger had vanished completely. After a long moment, she looked back at him. "Why did you help me?" Ethan leaned casually against the side of the emitter housing and folded his arms. "I think we covered that part earlier." Lyra shook her head slightly. "You said you help people because you used to rescue strangers. But that does not explain something else." Ethan raised one eyebrow. "Which part?" Lyra studied him carefully before answering. "You were not afraid of me." Ethan let out a quiet breath that turned briefly visible in the cooling air. "Fear is not always the most useful reaction," he said calmly. "Out here it usually just slows you down." Lyra considered that answer carefully. Most beings fear what they do not understand. Ethan smiled faintly. "That is true, but sometimes curiosity wins." Lyra turned her attention briefly to the restraint emitter still sitting in the sand beside them. The small machine continued humming softly, as if nothing unusual had happened. "The hunters will notice the release signal eventually," she said. Ethan nodded once. "I am sure they will." Lyra looked back at the horizon again, the golden glow of her eyes scanning the dark sky. "They may already be on their way." Ethan pushed himself upright from the emitter and glanced toward the distant outline of his rover parked on the ridge above the basin. The vehicle's navigation lights glowed faintly against the darkness. "Then we probably should not stay here," he said simply. Lyra followed his gaze toward the ridge. "That machine belongs to you." Ethan nodded. "Cargo rover. Not fast enough to outrun a starship, but good enough to cross the desert before sunrise." Lyra looked back at him with renewed focus. "You would take me with you." Ethan tilted his head slightly, as if the idea required very little thought. "Leaving you here again would defeat the purpose of everything we just did." Lyra was silent for a moment. The wind moved gently through her silver hair while she studied the human standing in front of her. Something thoughtful passed across her expression. Finally she spoke again, her voice quieter than before. "Ethan Carter, your species is stranger than the stories claim." Ethan chuckled softly and gestured toward the ridge where the rover waited. "You have not seen the strange part yet." Lyra glanced once more at the inactive collar in her hand before letting it fall into the sand beside the emitter. Then she stepped forward out of the circle where the restraint field had once been and joined him beneath the open night sky. The climb out of the basin was slow but steady as Ethan Carter led the way up the shallow ridge toward the parked rover, his boots crunching softly against the hardened desert soil. The cold night wind brushed across the open landscape, carrying the faint scent of minerals and distant stone, while the stars overhead burned brighter with every passing minute. Lyra followed a few steps behind him, moving with natural balance despite the uneven ground. Without the restraint field surrounding her, her movements carried a quiet confidence that had been hidden earlier beneath anger and exhaustion. Ethan reached the top of the ridge first and paused beside the rover, resting one hand on the vehicle's metal frame while glancing across the horizon out of habit. The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by low rock formations and the faint glow of distant mining beacons nearly 15 miles away. For now the sky remained quiet. Lyra stepped up beside him and studied the rover with curious attention. The machine was compact and rugged, its reinforced tires half buried in red dust from the long drive across the flats. Several storage containers were secured to the rear frame, along with a small navigation antenna that blinked slowly against the night sky. "This vehicle carried you across the desert alone," she said thoughtfully. Ethan nodded while brushing a thin layer of dust from the driver's door. "Most days it does the job just fine." He pulled the door open and reached inside to activate the cabin lights. The interior glowed softly as the rover's systems awakened, the control panel lighting up with quiet electronic chimes. Lyra studied the vehicle carefully. "Your technology appears simple compared to interstellar craft." Ethan climbed into the driver's seat and began checking the navigation display while responding casually. "Simple usually means reliable. Out here reliability matters more than elegance." Lyra stepped closer to the open passenger side door and looked inside the cabin. The rover smelled faintly of metal, engine coolant, and recycled air. A small thermal blanket was folded behind the seats along with a water container and several sealed supply packs. Ethan tapped the navigation screen and glanced toward her. "You might want to get inside." Lyra tilted her head slightly. "Why?" Ethan pointed toward the sky beyond the ridge. Because once the hunters realize that restraint collar released, they are going to start looking for the reason. Lyra followed his gesture and looked up at the vast stretch of stars above them. For a moment she saw nothing unusual. Then a faint streak of light moved across the distant upper atmosphere far beyond the horizon. Her eyes narrowed slightly as the realization settled in. That is not a natural meteor. Ethan gave a small nod. That is what I was thinking too. Lyra looked back at him with renewed seriousness. Then we should leave immediately. Ethan reached forward and activated the rover's engine. The machine responded with a deep mechanical rumble that echoed softly across the ridge before settling into a steady idle. The dashboard display flickered to life as navigation markers appeared on the screen. Already working on it, he said calmly. Lyra climbed into the passenger seat and pulled the door closed just as the wind picked up again across the desert plateau. Ethan adjusted the steering controls and guided the rover forward toward the descending slope on the far side of the ridge. The vehicle rolled slowly at first before picking up speed as it reached the open flats. Behind them, the quiet basin where the restraint emitter still sat faded into darkness. Ahead of them, the endless desert stretched toward the distant mining lights while the faint streak in the sky continued its slow descent through the atmosphere. The rover rolled across the open desert at nearly 40 miles per hour, its reinforced tires sending thin waves of red dust trailing behind them as Ethan Carter guided the vehicle across the dark flats. The headlights carved two bright tunnels through the night, illuminating scattered stones and wind-shaped ridges that passed beneath the wheels in a steady rhythm. Inside the cabin, the engine's low mechanical hum blended with the soft beeping of the navigation display, while cold desert air rattled lightly against the reinforced windows. Lyra sat in the passenger seat watching the horizon through the windshield, her golden eyes reflecting the glow of the dashboard lights. The faint streak they had seen in the sky minutes earlier was now brighter, descending slowly through the upper atmosphere like a distant star that had decided to fall. Ethan adjusted the steering controls and glanced at the navigation panel where a digital compass flickered between headings. The mining outpost lights remained about 14 miles away, a small cluster of artificial glow against the endless darkness of the desert. Lyra studied the falling light carefully before speaking. That is not a meteor or survey probe. Ethan nodded once. I agree. The descent pattern is too controlled. Lyra leaned slightly closer to the windshield as the rover crossed another stretch of open ground. Hunters often deploy scout craft first before retrieving their targets. Ethan raised one eyebrow while keeping his attention on the terrain ahead. While that sounds inconvenient for us. Lyra turned her head toward him, her expression serious but calm. They will not abandon their prisoner easily. Ethan gave a small shrug as the rover bounced lightly over a shallow ridge. Good thing you are not their prisoner anymore. The falling light in the sky brightened again as it pierced through the thinner layers of the atmosphere. For a brief moment, the desert surface reflected the glow like distant lightning. Lyra followed the motion carefully. If that craft reaches the basin where you freed me, they will detect the inactive restraint emitter immediately. Ethan glanced briefly in the rearview mirror where darkness swallowed the path they had taken. Then they will know someone helped you escape. Lyra looked back toward the horizon ahead of them. And they will search this region. Ethan's voice remained calm as he increased the rover's speed slightly. Then it is fortunate we are already leaving the region. The rover surged forward across the flat desert floor, its engine pushing harder as the terrain smoothed beneath the wheels. Lyra remained quiet for a few seconds while studying the human beside her. The steady focus in Ethan's posture had not changed since he first approached her in the basin. Finally, she spoke again. Ethan Carter. You do not appear concerned that they may identify you. Ethan smiled faintly without looking away from the road ahead. Concerned is different from surprised. Lyra tilted her head slightly. Explain. Ethan adjusted the steering wheel as another ridge passed beneath the tires. Anyone who decides to help a stranger escape hunters probably accepts that the hunters will eventually notice. Lyra watched him thoughtfully. Yet you still chose to help. Ethan let out a quiet breath while the rover continued racing across the dark flats. Like I said earlier, nobody survives out here alone for very long. Ahead of them, the faint lights of the mining outpost grew slightly brighter on the horizon, while the descending streak in the sky behind them continued moving steadily toward the basin they had left behind. The rover continued racing across the dark desert flats while the faint glow of the mining outpost slowly expanded on the horizon ahead of them, its scattered lights flickering like distant stars against the endless red landscape. Ethan Carter kept both hands steady on the steering wheel as the vehicle's engine hummed beneath the cabin floor, pushing them forward at nearly 45 miles per hour. The terrain had flattened somewhat here, allowing the reinforced tires to roll more smoothly across the hardened ground. Inside the rover, the dashboard lights cast a soft blue glow across the interior, while the navigation screen tracked their heading toward the small cluster of buildings nearly 12 miles away. Lyra remained focused on the sky behind them where the descending craft had now grown brighter, its controlled path unmistakable against the darkness. The object moved slowly but steadily, dropping through the upper atmosphere with a faint silver trail that occasionally shimmered when it crossed thin layers of cloud. "They have begun their search," Lyra said quietly. Ethan glanced briefly at the rear camera feed displayed on the corner of the navigation screen. The distant glow was visible even there. "Now, looks like they are taking their time," he replied calmly. Lyra turned her head toward him. "That is not caution. That is confidence." Ethan raised one eyebrow. "Meaning?" Lyra watched the glowing trail carefully before answering. "They believe the prisoner cannot travel far across open desert terrain without transport." Ethan allowed a small smile to form as the rover accelerated slightly over another stretch of flat ground. "Well, good thing you found someone with a vehicle then." Lyra studied him thoughtfully. "Your confidence continues to surprise me." Ethan kept his attention on the road ahead. Years of rescue work taught him that calm thinking often mattered more than speed when crossing unpredictable terrain. Confidence is useful when panic does not help. Lyra leaned back slightly in the passenger seat, still watching the sky. After a moment, she spoke again. "There is something you should know." Ethan glanced toward her briefly before returning his focus to the horizon. "That sounds serious." Lyra nodded once. "The hunters searching for me are not simply bounty trackers or traders." Ethan slowed the rover slightly as they approached a shallow ridge cutting across their path. "What are they then?" Lyra's golden eyes reflected the dashboard light as she answered. "They serve a private authority within my people's territory." Ethan considered that for a moment. Authority usually means politics. Lyra did not disagree. "My escape would be considered an embarrassment to those who ordered my capture." Ethan guided the rover over the ridge and back onto the open flats beyond it. The outpost lights were now clearly visible ahead, their artificial glow reflecting faintly off the dust clouds drifting across the ground. "That explains why they seem motivated." Lyra looked directly at him now. "You should also understand something else." Ethan nodded slightly. "Go ahead." Lyra's voice grew quieter but carried a weight that had not been present before. "The hunters were not simply transporting me somewhere. They were returning me to a political council that believes my presence creates instability among my people." Ethan kept the rover moving steadily forward. "That sounds complicated." Lyra held his gaze for a moment longer before speaking again. "I am not simply a traveler or a civilian they captured." Ethan glanced at her again, curious now. "Then what are you?" Lyra looked out toward the distant mining outpost lights while the falling craft behind them continued its descent toward the basin they had left behind. After a brief silence, she answered calmly. "I am the daughter of the ruling house that governs the star systems beyond this frontier." The rover moved steadily across the desert plain while the mining outpost lights ahead of them grew larger against the dark horizon. Small towers and landing beacons now visible as pale shapes rising from the red dust. Ethan Carter kept the vehicle's speed steady while the engine hummed beneath the floor, the tires rolling across the hardened ground with a rhythmic vibration that traveled gently through the steering wheel. For several seconds, he said nothing after Lyra's words, letting the quiet of the desert and the sound of the rover fill the cabin. Finally, he glanced toward her with a thoughtful expression. "Daughter of the ruling house," he repeated calmly. "That explains why those hunters seem so motivated tonight." Lyra watched the approaching outpost lights through the windshield while the glow from the dashboard reflected faintly across her blue skin. "My people call the title heir of the Celestial Council," she said quietly. Ethan let out a slow breath and gave a small nod. "That sounds like the kind of position that comes with complicated expectations." Lyra did not deny it. "Many factions believe my existence represents a future they do not want." Ethan adjusted the rover's course slightly to avoid a cluster of exposed rock formations. Politics has always been a dangerous profession. Lyra studied him carefully. Your reaction is unexpectedly calm. Ethan allowed a faint smile to appear as the vehicle rolled forward across another stretch of open ground. I spent most of my life rescuing fishermen, hikers, and cargo pilots who got themselves lost in storms. Compared to that, royal politics is just a different kind of weather. Lyra considered that metaphor in silence while the rover continued moving toward the outpost lights. Behind them, the descending craft had now dropped far enough through the atmosphere that its glow flickered across the rear camera display on the dashboard. The hunters will reach the basin soon, she said quietly. Ethan glanced briefly at the screen before returning his attention to the road. Then they will find an empty restraint collar and an inactive emitter. Lyra turned slightly in her seat. They will also begin searching every transport signal within range. Ethan nodded once. That part one expected. The rover crested a low ridge, and the mining outpost came fully into view ahead of them. A small cluster of metal structures stood against the desert floor, surrounded by landing pads, supply towers, and tall floodlights that illuminated the surrounding terrain in pale white beams. Lyra watched the settlement carefully. You are bringing me to a human station. Ethan slowed the rover as they approached the outer perimeter beacons. It is the closest place where we can disappear into a crowd. Lyra tilted her head slightly. Crowds are not common on frontier mining stations. Ethan chuckled quietly. True, but they are common enough that two travelers arriving in a dusty rover will not attract much attention. The vehicle rolled down the final slope toward the outpost entrance road while the floodlights grew brighter through the windshield. Lyra remained silent for a moment before speaking again. Ethan Carter, your decision tonight may change more than you realize. Ethan kept his hands steady on the wheel as the rover passed beneath the first perimeter light. That tends to happen when someone decides to help a stranger. Lyra looked toward the glowing station ahead of them, then back toward the dark desert behind where the distant craft continued its silent descent. After a long pause, she spoke again, her voice softer than before. My people believe humans are reckless and unpredictable. Ethan slowed the rover as the station gate sensors scanned the vehicle. We usually are. Lyra studied him for one final moment before looking forward again. Then perhaps that is exactly why the galaxy will remember what you did tonight.